Search for a Method by Jean-Paul Sartre. This is the second half of Chapter 1, Marxism and Existentialism. At about that time, the writers whom we loved explained to us that existence is a scandal. What interested us, however, was real men with their labors and their troubles. We cried out for a philosophy which would account for everything, and we did not perceive that it existed already, and that it was precisely this philosophy which provoked in us this demand. At that time, one book enjoyed a great success among us, Jean Wall's Toward the Concrete, yet we were disappointed by this toward. The total concrete was what we wanted to leave behind us. The absolute concrete was what we wanted to achieve. Still, the work pleased us, for it embarrassed idealism by discovering in the universe paradoxes, ambiguities, conflicts still unresolved. We learned to turn pluralism, that concept of the right, against the optimistic, monistic idealism of our professors, in the name of a leftist thought which was still ignorant of itself. Enthusiastically, we adopted all those doctrines which divided men into watertight groups, petit bourgeois Democrats. We rejected racism, but we liked to think that primitive mentality, the universe of the child and the madman, remained entirely impenetrable to us. Under the influence of war and the Russian Revolution, we offered violence, only theoretically, of course, in opposition to the sweet dreams of our professors. It was a wretched violence, insults, brawls, suicides, murders, irreparable catastrophes, which risked leading us to fascism. But in our eyes, it had the advantage of highlighting the contradictions of reality. Thus, Marxism as a philosophy which had become the world, wrenched us away from the defunct culture of a bourgeoisie which was barely subsisting on its past. We plunged blindly down the dangerous path of a pluralist realism, concerned with man and things in their concrete existence. Yet we remained within the compass of dominating ideas. Although we wanted to know man in his real life, we did not as yet have the idea of considering him first a worker who produces the conditions of his life. For a long time, we confused the total and the individual. Pluralism, which had served us so well against M. Brunschvic's idealism, prevented us from understanding the dialectical totalization. It pleased us to decree essences and artificially isolated types, rather than to reconstitute the synthetic movement of a truth that had become. Political events led us to employ the schema of the class struggle as a sort of grid, more convenient than veridical. But it took the whole bloody history of this half-century to make us grasp the reality of the class struggle and to situate us in a split society. It was the war which shattered the worn structures of our thought, war, occupation, resistance, the years which followed. We wanted to fight at the side of the working class. We finally understood that the concrete is history and dialectical action. We had repudiated pluralist realism only to have found it again among the fascists, and we discovered the world. Why then has existentialism preserved its autonomy? Why has it not simply dissolved in Marxism? Lucas believed that he had answered this question in a small book called Existentialism and Marxism. According to him, bourgeois intellectuals have been forced to abandon the method of idealism while safeguarding its results and its foundations. Hence the historical necessity of a third path between materialism and idealism, in actuality, and in the bourgeois consciousness during the imperialistic period. I shall show later the havoc which this wish to conceptualize a priori has wrought at the center of Marxism. Here let us simply observe that Lucas fails absolutely to account for the principal fact. We were convinced at one and the same time that historical materialism furnished the only valid interpretation of history, and that existentialism remained the only concrete approach to reality. I do not pretend to deny the contradictions of this attitude. I simply assert that Lucas does not even suspect it. Many intellectuals, many students have lived and still live with the tension of this double demand. How does this come about? It is due to a circumstance which Lucas knew perfectly well, but which he could not at that time even mention. Marxism, after drawing us to it as the moon draws the tides, after transforming all our ideas, after liquidating the categories of our bourgeois thought, abruptly left us stranded. It did not satisfy our need to understand. In the particular situation in which we were placed, it no longer had anything new to teach us, because it had come to a stop. Marxism stopped, precisely because this philosophy wants to change the world, because its aim is philosophy becoming the world, because it is and wants to be practical. There arose within it a veritable schism, which rejected theory on one side and praxis on the other. From the moment the USSR, encircled and alone, undertook its gigantic effort at industrialization, Marxism found itself unable to bear the shock of these new struggles, the practical necessities and the mistakes which are always inseparable from them. At this period of withdrawal for the USSR and of ebb tide for the revolutionary proletariats, the ideology itself was subordinated to a double need: security, that is, unity, and the construction of socialism inside the USSR. Concrete thought must be born from praxis and must turn back upon it in order to clarify it, not by chance and without rules, but, as in all sciences and all techniques, in conformity with principles. Now the party leaders, bent on pushing the integration of the group to the limit, feared that the free process of truth, with all the discussions and all the conflicts which it involves, would break the unity of combat. They reserved for themselves the right to define the line and to interpret the event. In addition, out of fear that the experience might not provide its own clarities, that it might put into question certain of their guiding ideas and might contribute to weakening the ideological struggle, they put the doctrine out of reach. The separation of theory and practice resulted in transforming the latter into an empiricism without principles, the former into a pure, fixed knowledge. On the other hand, the economic planning imposed by a bureaucracy unwilling to recognize its mistakes became thereby a violence done to reality. And since the future production of a nation was determined in offices, often outside its own territory, this violence had as its counterpart an absolute idealism. Men and things had to yield to ideas. A priori, experience, when it did not verify the predictions, could only be wrong. Budapest's subway was real in Rákosi's head. If Budapest's subsoil did not allow him to construct a subway, this was because the subsoil was counter-revolutionary. Marxism, as a philosophical interpretation of man and of history, necessarily had to reflect the preconceptions of the planned economy. This fixed image of idealism and of violence did idealistic violence to facts. For years, the Marxist intellectual believed that he served his party by violating experience, by overlooking embarrassing details, by grossly simplifying the data, and above all, by conceptualizing the event before having studied it. And I do not mean to speak only of communists, but of all the others, fellow travelers, Trotskyites, and Trotsky sympathizers, for they have been created by their sympathy for the Communist Party or by their opposition to it. On November 4th, 1956, at the time of the Second Soviet intervention in Hungary, each group already had its mind made up before it possessed any information on the situation. It had decided in advance whether it was witnessing an act of aggression on the part of the Russian bureaucracy against the democracy of workers' committees, with a revolt of the masses against the bureaucratic system, or with a counter-revolutionary attempt which Soviet moderation had known how to check. Later there was news, a great deal of news, but I have not heard it said that even one Marxist changed his opinion. Among the interpretations which I have just mentioned, there is one which shows the method in all its nakedness, that which reduces the facts in Hungary to a Soviet act of aggression against the democracy of workers' committees. It is obvious that the workers' committees are a democratic institution. One can even maintain that they bear within them the future of the socialist society. But this does not alter the fact that they did not exist in Hungary at the time of the first Soviet intervention, and their appearance during the insurrection was much too brief and too troubled for us to be able to speak of an organized democracy. No matter. There were workers' committees. A Soviet intervention took place. Starting from there, Marxist idealism proceeds to two simultaneous operations: conceptualization and passage to the limit. They push the empirical notion to the perfection of the type, the germ to its total development. At the same time, they reject the equivocal givens of experience. These could only lead one astray. We will find ourselves then in the presence of a typical contradiction between two Platonic ideas. On the one side, the wavering policy of the USSR gave way to the rigorous and predictable action of that entity, the Soviet bureaucracy. On the other side, the workers' committees disappeared before that other entity, the direct democracy. I shall call these two objects general particularities. They are made to pass for particular historical realities when we ought not to see in them anything more than the purely formal unity of abstract, universal relations. The process of making them into fetishes will be complete when each one is endowed with real powers. The democracy of workers' committees holds within itself the absolute negation of the bureaucracy, which reacts by crushing its adversary. Now there can be no doubt that the fruitfulness of living Marxism stemmed in part from its way of approaching experience. Marx was convinced that facts are never isolated appearances, that if they come into being together, it is always within the higher unity of a whole, that they are bound to each other by internal relations, and that the presence of one profoundly modifies the nature of the other. Consequently, Marx approached the study of the Revolution of February 1848, or Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'etat, with a synthetic intent. He saw in these events totalities produced and at the same time split apart by their internal contradictions. Of course, the physicist's hypothesis, before it has been confirmed by experimentation, is also an interpretation of experience. It rejects empiricism simply because it is mute. But the constitutive schema of this hypothesis is universalizing, not totalizing. It determines a relation, a function, and not a concrete totality. The Marxist approaches the historical process with universalizing and totalizing schemata. Naturally, the totalization was not made by chance. The theory had determined the choice of perspective and the order of the conditioning factors. It studied each particular process within the framework of a general system in evolution. But in no case in Marx's own work does this putting in perspective claim to prevent or to render useless the appreciation of the process as a unique totality. When, for example, he studies the brief and tragic history of the Republic of 1848, he does not limit himself, as would be done today, to stating that the Republican petite bourgeoisie betrayed its ally, the proletariat. On the contrary, he tries to account for this tragedy in its details and in the aggregate. If he subordinates anecdotal facts to the totality of a movement, of an attitude, he also seeks to discover the totality by means of the facts. In other words, he gives to each event, in addition to its particular signification, the role of being revealing. Since the ruling principle of the inquiry is the search for the synthetic ensemble, each fact, once established, is questioned and interpreted as part of a whole. It is on the basis of the fact, through the study of its lack and its over-significations, that one determines by virtue of a hypothesis the totality at the heart of which the fact will recover its truth. Thus, living Marxism is heuristic. Its principles and its prior knowledge appear as regulative in relation to its concrete research. In the work of Marx, we never find entities. Totalities, e.g. the petite bourgeoisie of the 18th premiere, or living. They furnish their own definitions within the framework of the research. Otherwise, we could not understand the importance which Marxists attach even today to the analysis of a situation. It goes without saying that this analysis is not enough, and that it is but the first moment in an effort at synthetic reconstruction. But it is apparent also that the analysis is indispensable to the later reconstruction of the total structures. Marxist voluntarism, which likes to speak of analysis, has reduced this operation to a simple ceremony. There is no longer any question of studying facts within the general perspective of Marxism, so as to enrich our understanding and to clarify action. Analysis consists solely in getting rid of detail, in forcing the signification of certain events, in denaturing facts, or even in inventing a nature for them, in order to discover it later underneath them, as their substance, as unchangeable, fetishized synthetic notions. The open concepts of Marxism have closed in. They are no longer keys, interpretive schemata. They are posited for themselves as an already totalized knowledge. To use Kantian terms, Marxism makes out of these particularized, fetishized types constitutive concepts of experience. The real content of these typical concepts is always past knowledge, but today's Marxist makes of it an internal knowledge. His sole concern at the moment of analysis will be to place these entities. The more he is convinced that they represent truth a priori, the less fussy he will be about proof. The Kirstein Amendment, the appeals of Radio Free Europe, rumors, these are sufficient for the French communists to place the entity world imperialism at the origin of the events in Hungary. The totalizing investigation has given way to a scholasticism of the totality. The heuristic principle to search for the whole in its parts has become the terrorist practice of liquidating the particularity. It is not by chance that Lucas, who so often violates history, has found in 1956 the best definition of this frozen Marxism. 20 years of practice give him all the authority necessary to call this pseudo-philosophy a voluntarist idealism. Today's social and historical experience falls outside of knowledge. Bourgeois concepts just manage to revive and quickly break down. Those which survive lack any foundation. The real attainments of American sociology cannot hide its theoretical uncertainty. Psychoanalysis, after a spectacular beginning, has stood still. It knows a great many details, but it lacks any firm foundation. Marxism possesses theoretical bases. It embraces all human activity, but it no longer knows anything. Its concepts are dictates. Its goal is no longer to increase what it knows, but to be itself constituted a priori as an absolute knowledge. In view of this twofold ignorance, existentialism has been able to return and to maintain itself because it reaffirmed the reality of men as Kierkegaard asserted his own reality against Hegel. However, the Dane rejected the Hegelian conception of man and of the real. Existentialism and Marxism, on the contrary, aim at the same object, but Marxism has reabsorbed man into the idea, and existentialism seeks him everywhere, where he is, at his work, in his home, in the street. We certainly do not claim, as Kierkegaard did, that this real man is unknowable. We say only that he is not known. If for the time being he escapes knowledge, it is because the only concepts at our disposal for understanding him are borrowed either from the idealism of the right or from the idealism of the left. We are careful not to confuse these two idealisms. The former merits its name by the content of its concepts, and the latter by the use which today it makes of its concepts. It is true also that among the masses, Marxist practice does not reflect, or only slightly reflects, the sclerosis of its theory. But it is precisely the conflict between revolutionary action and the scholastic justification of this action which prevents communist man, in socialist countries as in bourgeois countries, from achieving any clear self-consciousness. One of the most striking characteristics of our time is the fact that history is made without self-awareness. No doubt someone will say this has always been the case, and this was true up until the second half of the last century. That is, until Marx. But what has made the force and richness of Marxism is the fact that it has been the most radical attempt to clarify the historical process in its totality. For the last 20 years, on the contrary, its shadow has obscured history. This is because it has ceased to live with history, and because it attempts, through a bureaucratic conservatism, to reduce change to identity. Yet we must be clear about all this. This sclerosis does not correspond to a normal aging. It is produced by a worldwide combination of circumstances of a particular type. Far from being exhausted, Marxism is still very young, almost in its infancy. It has scarcely begun to develop. It remains, therefore, the philosophy of our time. We cannot go beyond it because we have not gone beyond the circumstances which engendered it. Our thoughts, whatever they may be, can be formed only upon this humus. They must be contained within the framework which it furnishes for them, or be lost in the void of retrogress. Existentialism, like Marxism, addresses itself to experience in order to discover their concrete syntheses. It can conceive of these syntheses only within a moving dialectical totalization, which is nothing else but history, or from the strictly structural point of view which we have adopted here, philosophy becoming the world. For us, truth is something which becomes. It has and will have become. It is a totalization which is forever being totalized. Particular facts do not signify anything. They are neither true nor false so long as they are not related, through the mediation of various partial totalities, to the totalization in process. Let us go further. We agree with Garotti when he writes, Marxism forms today the system of coordinates which alone permits it to situate and to define a thought in any domain whatsoever, from political economy to physics, from history to ethics. And we should agree all the more readily if he had extended his statement. But this was not his subject, to the actions of individuals and masses, to specific works, to modes of life, to labor, to feelings, to the particular evolution of an institution or a character. To go further, we are also in full agreement with Engels when he wrote in that letter which furnished Plekhanov the occasion for a famous attack against Bernstein. There does not exist, as one would like to imagine now and then, simply for convenience, any effect produced automatically by the economic situation. On the contrary, it is men themselves who make their history, but within a given environment which conditions them and on the basis of real prior conditions, among which economic conditions, no matter how much influenced they may be by other political and ideological conditions, are nevertheless, in the final analysis, the determining conditions, constituting from one end to the other the guiding thread which alone puts us in a position to understand. It is already evident that we do not conceive of economic conditions as the simple static structure of an unchangeable society. It is the contradictions within them which form the driving force of history. It is amusing that Lucas, in the work which I have already quoted, believed he was distinguishing himself from us by recalling that Marxist definition of materialism, the primacy of existence over consciousness, whereas existentialism, as its name sufficiently indicates, makes of this primacy the object of its fundamental affirmation. To be still more explicit, we support unreservedly that formulation in capital by which Marx means to define his materialism. The mode of production of material life generally dominates the development of social, political, and intellectual life. We cannot conceive of this conditioning in any form except that of a dialectical movement, contradictions surpassing totalizations. M. Rubel criticizes me for not making any allusion to this Marxist materialism in the article I wrote in 1946, Materialism and Revolution. But he himself supplies the reason for this omission. It is true that this author is directing his comments at Engels rather than at Marx. Yes, and even more at contemporary French Marxists. But Marx's statement seems to me to point to a factual evidence which we cannot go beyond so long as the transformations of social relations and technical progress have not freed man from the yoke of scarcity. We are all acquainted with the passage in which Marx alludes to that far-off time. This reign of freedom does not begin, in fact, until the time when the work imposed by necessity and external finality shall cease. It is found, therefore, beyond the sphere of material production proper. As soon as there will exist for everyone a margin of real freedom beyond the production of life, Marxism will have lived out its span. A philosophy of freedom will take its place. But we have no means, no intellectual instrument, no concrete experience which allows us to conceive of this freedom or of this philosophy.